I wasn't sure if I should continue doing these impressions videos, or anime videos at all for that matter, but before I do something as drastic as drop them altogether, I decided to approach it from a different angle. This time, I'm not trying to pack in as many shows as possible or cover every popular show. Instead, I'm solely talking about the ones that I would actually check out, based on studio, genre, or just because I saw people talking about them on Twitter. Let me know what you think, if I should drop the series, or if you have any ideas on how to do something more fun or interesting with it. Now that that's out of the way, onto the shows. This show initially confused the hell out of me because I didn't read the synopsis going in and was under the impression that the bunny girl was a ghost or something. But that's not the case. Instead, she ends up being an immensely popular child actor that's currently on hiatus, suffering from a mysterious phenomenon that causes her to randomly become invisible to everyone except for the main character. Turns out that the main character and his sister also experienced similar things, and so they partner up and presumably figure out what's going on by the end of the series. I have no idea how far or deep this show plans on going, but it handled its concepts with a surprising amount of grace. The idea of an overworked and overexposed child star shrugging off the spotlight and literally fading from existence as a result of it is an intriguing concept ripe for exploration in and of itself, and the existence of other unexplainable phenomena only adds to the mystery. The atmosphere here is kind of flat, very visual novel adaptation-esque, and the two main characters seem like they want to die, but this direction came off to me as being intentional, and I thought it went over quite well. Sure, the main guy is a little grating and the visuals aren't awe-inspiring, but the interactions between the main guy and the child actress weren't frustrating to watch, and the show at least looks like it was made this decade. It really reminded me of Haruhi, but more depressed. That's a bold statement coming from me, and I don't want to make it seem like I think this is a slam dunk 10 out of 10 show based off of one episode, but it's certainly promising, especially when the cover art and title make it out to be a cheap fan service show. I think this is one to keep an eye on. This is a romance show with a simple-to-understand premise. Within a boarding school, there are two warring factions, the two main characters are the leaders of the two factions, and they secretly like each other. It's basically an inverse version of Nisekoi, since they actually like each other and have to keep it secret instead of hating each other and pretending to like each other to keep the peace. That being said, I look at it as being a knockoff version of Nisekoi. That's not to say that I think Nisekoi is an artistic masterpiece, it's not, but the first season of the show was a pretty great distillation of what makes this genre popular. Characters that people can get behind, and interesting scenarios to put those characters in. The characters in this show are forgettable, both in their designs and personalities. The writing in this first episode was insanely lazy, which would have been okay if it allowed for interesting moments, but it didn't. The way the scenes play out here are so by the book and cliché that it's hard to imagine that real human beings took time out of their lives to make it. It's shows like these that make me wonder if the anime industry has developed an algorithm to churn these things out. Just like most other shows in this genre, it'll probably end in the most unsatisfying way possible and never get a sequel, since its main objective is not to be a good standalone show, but rather to be an advertisement for the source material. It might sound like I think this is the worst show ever, but I actually think it's fairly competent by the standards of the last few years of anime. So here's my conundrum. Do I talk about the quality of these shows relative to other recent anime, or in a vacuum? Because for a long time, I've just accepted that what I call a decent anime is probably going to be worse than what I call a decent video game or album. If all you do is watch anime, then this is actually a decent-ish show by the looks of it, but if your world exists beyond seasonal anime, which mine does, then watching this is a complete waste of time. This is PA Works' show for the season, and while Mari Okada is not listed as staff, this show is more in line with her collaborations with PA Works. Shows I loved like Nagi no Asukara and Hanasaku Iroha, but let's not get too excited since this is the same studio that brought us Glass Slip and Charlotte. This show is about the miserable granddaughter of a mage who can't see color. That last part isn't very well articulated though, I didn't pick up on it until the very end of the episode. It begins with this girl at a fireworks festival, but only a brief few moments later, the grandmother arrives and teleports her back a few decades to 2018 with little to no explanation. She arrives in the same town she grew up in, interacts with some of the high school-aged kids, and then ends up going to her grandmother's magic shop, only to find that this timeline's version of her is currently studying abroad in England. By using a letter given to her by her grandmother, she's able to convince what I think was her great-grandmother and great-great-grandmother that this whole time travel thing is totally legit and she's part of the family. After getting settled into her new but not really new home, she sees a high school boy that she ran into earlier drawing in the park, but she's able to see the colors of his drawing. Then the episode ends. I don't think it's a bad premise at all, and the characters seem alright, but again, the core concepts were not very well explained, and there's not much of a hook in this first episode. It's incredibly hard to tell how much is or isn't going to happen, especially since this is an anime original. Not sure what to think of this one, but I wasn't miserable while watching it, so that's gotta be worth something. Just like Citrus from, I think, 2 seasons ago, this is an adaptation of a somewhat well-known Yuri manga. The official English version was published as Bloom Into You. The episode begins with the main character entering high school, and after being conveniently goaded by a teacher, she promptly joins the student council. On the way to the student council room, she watches the other girl on the cover reject some guy that's confessing to her, and it turns out that this girl is also in the student council. Coincidentally, the first girl also received a confession right after middle school graduation and still hasn't given a reply after a month. After working up the courage to ask, the second girl gives her some advice, and the first girl calls the guy to reject him. After that, the second girl decides she's in love with the first girl, and that's pretty much the episode. Writing all that out makes the show seem super uninteresting, which for the most part it is, but the color palette, art style, and soundtrack all give this show a light, airy feel that's enjoyable enough, but not quite doing it for me. I actually ended up watching all of Citrus a while back, and while nothing too worthwhile ever happened, I kept watching because on a base level, I enjoyed how emotive and colorful the characters and their interactions were. That's not something I can say about this show, though, which seems far more subdued and not in a good way. We're not going to spend much time on this one because it's a complete waste of time, and with an average user score of 4.55 on MAL, it seems that most people agree with me for once. Staying true to my new method of doing this series, I only checked out this show because I was genuinely enticed by its cover art. Look at it, it looks great. The font, the colors, the way the text is layered behind and in front of the characters. I expected to tell you that the show was boring but had a great sense of style. Ironically, the visuals are going to be what immediately turns people off to this thing. It's a hideous, low poly count mess. Just look at it for yourself, I'm sure you get the idea. So what's this show about? People living in a house. Yeah, this one is a hard pass. Gridman is thoroughly bizarre. It's made by Trigger, and it's an adaptation of Gridman the Hyper Agent, a live-action Japanese TV show from the creators of the iconic Ultraman. Just the latest in a long series of strange decisions that Trigger has made since Kill la Kill finished airing. Trigger's weirdness aside, I thought I was liking this show quite a bit. The dialogue and voice acting were amazing, especially from Rika, the main girl, and while there was some janky animation or lack thereof at points, it looked pretty decent generally speaking. So the premise here is that a guy wakes up in his classmate's family antique shop with no recollection of who he is, and begins to see things that no one else can see. An old computer in the shop calls itself Gridman and starts to talk to him, at which point the girl who found him knocked out begins to think he's insane. A little bit later, a giant monster that only he was able to see earlier attacks the city they're in, and the guy goes to the computer and becomes Gridman to save the day. This is where I lost any and all interest I had in this show because the fighting looks horrible. The monster is beyond stupid looking, the Gridman suit doesn't fare much better, and of course, this whole situation is one big plasticky CG mess. I'm not a fan of this type of stuff anyway, so even if it was decent, odds are I wouldn't like it, but this whole thing just didn't seem to work, which is a shame because again, the voice acting and dialogue really stuck out to me as being good. I have no idea what Trigger is doing, and based on this, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Doga Kobo is known for their colorful comedy shows, and while this one isn't exactly their best, it's not bad either. The premise here is that a former self-defense force officer is looking for a job and stumbles upon a listing for a maid. It turns out that it's for the home of a girl who she saw almost 2 years prior playing with her mother, but at some point the mother died, which caused the girl to become an antisocial shut-in. So now the father decides that hiring a maid to keep his daughter busy will fix the whole situation. The main source of comedy here comes from the maid being obsessed with young girls, and the MAL synopsis just straight up calls her a hardcore lolicon. From what I saw in this first episode, it did border on creepy from time to time, but outside the context of anime, it is 100% full-on creepy. Is it funny, though? A little, I think. The whole episode was just the girl trying to get away from this psychopathic maid, and while something that simple can't possibly stay entertaining for 12 episodes, it worked well enough for one. The visuals are fine, and it's overly animated at points in a way that complements the humor well. The whole thing about the mother dying seemed super out of place and a little too heavy for what this show is, but maybe it plans on going into that later on. So this thing is okay by the looks of it, but I wouldn't give it an outright recommendation, and it certainly doesn't go up there with Doga Kobo's best shows like Gabriel Dropout. I don't have too much to say about this show because there's not much to it. This is the definition of a junk food show, and I'm ashamed to admit that I enjoyed the first episode. Now, do I want to see 11 full episodes more? No way. But as far as 4 Koma Moe comedy adaptations go, you could do much, much worse than this. In fact, this really hits all of the main components you'd want to see. A distinct premise, characters with personality, and a cutesy atmosphere. The premise is beyond cheesy. A normal schoolgirl is in the forest looking for a vampire's house when suddenly the vampire finds her and takes her back to her house, which isn't actually in the forest, but instead next to a family whose name means forest. The rest of the episode is a bunch of gags revolving around the vampire being tame and the normal girl being overbearing. Eventually, the normal girl moves in with the vampire, and they presumably live out the rest of these 11 episodes tackling every vampire cliché in the book. It doesn't really matter for what this show is, but I've gotta say that it has a fuzzy, low-resolution look to it, and no one's going to say, wow, that was really well made after watching it, but again, I kind of enjoyed it. Like I said, this is not something I would ever watch the full run of, because it probably runs thin after episode 5, but hey, the first episode wasn't bad. We end with what is the most talked about show of the season so far, at least based on what I've seen. It's an adaptation of a pretty popular light novel that has a manga version as well. So why is it so talked about? As far as I can tell, it's entirely due to its brief bouts of graphic content, because outside of that, it is completely unremarkable. I'd guess that most of you have already seen this first episode by now, but if you haven't, it's so simplistic that I can summarize it in a few sentences. A newbie mage registers herself at the local adventurers guild and is promptly asked to join a group of other low-level adventurers that plan on tackling an allegedly easy goblin-killing bounty. The party arrives at the cave where the goblins reside, and they are quickly overwhelmed and one by one maimed, murdered, and raped. The mage is the only one that remains unscathed, and she is rescued by the mysterious Goblin Slayer, who then goes on to kill every goblin in the cave, including the younglings. Won't someone please think of the younglings? As the episode ends, it cuts back to the Adventurers Guild with the Goblin Slayer talking to the attendant. The mage comes in, decides to team up with him, and the episode ends. Outside of the violence, there's really not much here that separates this from a lot of other shows that I've seen. In fact, that one show from last season, Satsuriku no Tenshi, is basically the same premise of a small girl and a big emotionless killing machine in a dangerous setting. Of course, it's just an opinion, but in terms of raw story content, there is nothing in this first episode that is even remotely compelling to me, and if it weren't for those few brief scenes of the party getting brutalized, I don't think there would be any reason to talk about this show. So can a show sustain itself on just shock value alone? Maybe, but it's going to live and die on how shocking and well executed it is, and I don't think this episode managed to do either of those things. First off, those brutal scenes aren't like Devilman Crybaby. This show is being aired on TV, so it is censored to some degree, and its visuals that look as if they time-traveled here from 2007 aren't helping matters. The cave that the majority of the episode takes place in looks bad, and it's really hard to believe that the goblins are menacing when they're so crudely portrayed on screen. Of course, presentation isn't everything, but since the shock factor is the only thing this episode had going for it, I think it does matter quite a bit here. I'm sure there's thousands of people out there that would line up to tell me how wrong I am about this, but I'm just not seeing it based on this episode. If there wasn't so much conversation surrounding it, I definitely wouldn't have watched it in the first place, and while I'm sure that a lot of people checked it out for the same reason that I did, I don't see any appeal beyond that. A show like ReZero or Made in Abyss, I get it, but with Goblin Slayer, I'm not seeing that first episode hook. That being said, I checked out a few chapters of the manga version, and while it is the exact same story, it comes off a lot better just because of the presentation. Those same graphic scenes that felt flat to me in the show seemed a lot more intense and threatening in the manga. So I'm not a fan of the show at all, sorry if I'm disappointing anyone. The manga seems to hold up a little bit better, so maybe check that out if you're interested. While I'm not in love with any of the 8 shows I checked out here, this seems to be a pretty jam-packed season all things considered. A lot of big shows are getting sequels, Index, Sword Art Online, and Fairy Tail just to name a few, and the Bunny Girl show as well as PA Works Anime Original have genuine potential, I think. If you have your own thoughts on anything airing this season, or just want to call me a fucking idiot for not liking Goblin Slayer, feel free to do so down below, and until next time, thanks for watching.